Welcome to 6 Facts About School Vouchers. This is what I learned from reading Josh Cowen's book, The Privateers. I want to share this with you because I think it's very important. The first thing I learned is that school vouchers in the United States began as white flight. I didn't know that. It started with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which I'm sure you've all heard of. At that time, and within a year afterwards, Milton Friedman, the well-known economist who had won awards as an economist, came up with some ideas related to education after the introduction of school desegregation. He said, wait a minute, we should let the market drive school success. Remember, he was an economist. He said, let's let the parents choose where they want to send their children. He said, I deplore segregation, but there are two evils. There's segregation, which is so naughty, and then there's mandatory integration, which is just as bad. In fact, he said forced integration is just like Hitler's Nazism. So this is what he said we should do. Develop exclusively white schools, exclusively colored schools, and mixed schools, and then just let the parents choose. He said this isn't racism, this is about the free market. There were rising tensions over integration in that era, and so the solution would be a privately operated school system with parent choice of schools. This would be about individual liberty. This is about freedom of the marketplace. This is not about racism, Milton Friedman said. And so, moving from racism to school vouchers, 6 states bought in early and started working on this. In fact, Texas came up with that dual enrollment system. They said we're going to have white schools and Negro schools, and you can transfer your child to a Negro school if you want to, because they said we have only 2 choices. We either have to face forced integration or no education for our kids. And so they came up with this idea of a tuition grant plan. Give the parents money to pay tuition to a private school. However, the bill never passed. The second point I learned from this book is that school vouchers have always been funded by big conservative dollars. The Koch brothers were in it from the start. The Bradley Family Foundation of Milwaukee came in, and the DeVos family of Michigan has been a huge donor. Remember the DeVos Family Foundation? They fund the Center for Religious Life, which I believe includes the Heritage Foundation or vice versa. And remember now, Betsy DeVos, we all know her name, but she wasn't born until 1958, so she wasn't even born when this started. But later on, she bought in with her family and her husband, and she said, we are buying influence. We expect a return on our investment. We are buying influence. And then, of course, as you know, she became the Secretary of Education in the first Trump term. The third point about school vouchers that I learned from this book is that it went from racism very quickly to religion. As early as 1959 in St. Louis, a Catholic organization called Citizens for Educational Freedom was started. They said, we have a God-given and inalienable right to direct and control our children's education. And they said we want our fair share of tax dollars for parochial school use. It will be our individual liberty. And so big conservative money, of course, helped out. First of all, Milton Friedman got the Charles Koch involved. Charles Koch got the DeVos family involved. And these people always started from the presumption that when they talked about parents, they're talking about white, Christian, married, heterosexual people. They said school was a core function of democracy. I think we all believe school is a core function of democracy. But with them, school became a sectarian, theocratic version of publicly funded education. So the big money for white Christian married heterosexual couples based on Christianity. It wasn't until 1990, though, that the first actual voucher program was successfully started in the United States. Guess where? Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was called the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, which still exists today. It was funded with big money from the Bradley Foundation. Let me tell you about the Bradley Foundation. The money came from the Allen Bradley firm, which makes electrical controls. It was founded in 1942. So the foundation itself was founded in 1942. In 1962, it started to focus more on public policy. And then it moved especially toward religious fundamentalism and limited government. In 1985, that company was acquired by Rockwell International, and the foundation's value went very quickly from $14 million to $290 million. It became a leading funder of conservative efforts. For example, it funded 3 anti-Muslim groups. And then in 1990, Governor Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin signed school vouchers into law, and we had our first actual school voucher program. The movement started in 1955. It actually started in Wisconsin in 1990. It started with 341 children. They were considered low income. These were children, though, who had never been in public school. They all came from private schools already. 7 private schools became the first voucher program in Milwaukee. 2 years later, it was time to assess the program, and they found no improvement in attendance or test scores, but happier parents. And so a lot of people were giving up vouchers at high rates to return to public schools. That's one of the things that was found in the assessment. They were giving up their vouchers to return to public schools, even though the parents were happier. But people like DeVos family, Koch brothers, Bradley Foundation, who had funded this, were very unhappy. And they said, oh, we'll do our own research. We've got the money. We can fund our own research. And so they hired Paul Peterson. You're going to see his name come up a lot in this video. Paul Peterson said, oh, this thing was set up for failure right from the start. You know why? It was 7 private schools, but none of them were religious schools. And so, Josh Cowen tells us in his book, this unearthed and opened up unique levels of vitriol and fury. And some people started to say that 2-year assessment that was done, they were hiring a hired gun. And so we come to the point now in our history when big money meets religion. The Wisconsin Supreme Court voted 4-2 to expand the voucher program. And in the mid-1990s, they included religious schools in the voucher program, officially passed by the Supreme Court. In 1995, there were now 830 kids in the voucher program in Milwaukee. It involved 12 private schools. And then in 1996, Cleveland gave it a try. They had 50 schools involved. They were nearly all Catholic schools, and there were 2 pop-ups. You know what a pop-up school is? It's a school that doesn't exist until they realize there's money available, and then suddenly overnight a school pops up. The Walton Family Foundation funded this one. And they hired Paul Peterson to do the assessment, and he said they made large gains. Oh, wait a minute. He only evaluated the 2 pop-up schools, not the other 48. Oh, and he really evaluated only one of those schools and only 6th graders. Oh, and only African American 6th graders in that one pop-up school because they were the only ones that showed any impact from being moved to a voucher school. Now we had programs starting in New York City, Dayton, and Washington, D.C. Again, the money came from the Waltons, and this is how Cowen assesses the first 40 years of the efforts toward voucher schools. He says it was an isolated group of conservative scholars shouting their views from ivory towers. He said conservative priorities and libertarian economics were always behind this, and it was always funded by rich Republicans. They were hostile to government oversight, organized labor, and public education. And their theory was, if you don't like the results, just fund your own study and get the results you want. 3 wealthy foundations, therefore, got what they paid for. Cowen calls it a template for beginning, controlling, and distributing pro-voucher findings through a tightly connected and insular network of advocates that still exists today. And my 4th point that I took from this book is that there's been little change in this voucher program over 50 years. In 2002, the United States Supreme Court in Zellman v. Simmons-Harris decreed that public funding may pay for religious school tuition, absolutely, across the country. Taxpayer funding may pay for religious school tuition. And in Washington, D.C., we have a federally controlled school system now with a new promotional program funded by Dick and Betsy DeVos and the Walton Foundation. It was called DC Opportunity Scholarships, and the funding went from $150,000 to $12 million very quickly. Cowen says, unfortunately, the poorest of the poor had the poorest luck at gaining entry to this school program. Now, let's go back and look at how the Wisconsin program was doing from 1990 to 2006. In 2006, there were now 22,500 pupils. But Act 125 required a 5-year evaluation, so everybody thought, well, they'll ask the Department of Public Instruction to do it, right? But the Wisconsin legislature in 2006 insisted that Paul Peterson should be the one to do the assessment. He had started the school choice demonstration project in Arkansas. Okay? Everybody who was part of the evaluation of the Wisconsin program, 22,500 pupils, everybody who was part of that evaluation was a Paul Peterson protege. And wait till you find out who one of those Paul Peterson proteges was. By the way, it was funded by the Walton and Bradley Foundations, and this is what it measured mostly: parental satisfaction, school participation, how vouchers affected public schools. 3 years later, another report was done, which measured voucher school impact on character, crime, and parent religiosity. Go figure. So this is what Cowen says now in his book, The Privateers, about voucher school evaluation. He says, it's always been a school choice demonstration project, per Peterson. And Cowen now tells us he was part of it. He said, it was my first exposure to working with data and research supported by large funders in the Education Reform Network. So Cowen himself, the author of this book, was a Paul Peterson protege who went through that program in Arkansas and was hired to be one of the assessors. And this is what he said about his experience. He said, when they did publish my findings, if I had supportive data, it was in. But none of my more voluminous, skeptical scholarship has ever made it into those compendia. He said this is something they never published. Milwaukee voucher users left the program at extraordinarily high rates and improved their academic outcomes once returning to the public schools. This is something Cowen found in his assessment, but he was working for Paul Peterson and it was never published. He says now who's influencing these evaluations? The Heritage Foundation, the Cato Foundation, the Friedman Foundation, the Betsy DeVos program called American Federation for Children. And so the fifth point I learned from this book is that evaluation of the program has always been quite ridiculous. Now we'll talk quickly about special needs students. Cowen says private schools do admit students with special needs to avoid oversight on the admissions process. You see, if they're taking vouchers, they take a child who has special needs because there is oversight on, who are you admitting? But then they quietly counsel them out because retention data receives far less scrutiny than admissions data. Now, talk about Betsy DeVos. She designed her own philosophy of how you ought to go about voucher schools. Remember, she was the head of the Department of Education at one point. She says, we must move funding away from the state's public schools. Did you hear that? I got to say that again. Betsy DeVos believed we must move funding away from the state's public schools. This is taxpayer funding. Don't restrict eligibility to very low-income families or students from low-performing public schools. No. Focus on strong enrollment from the middle class. And so, in Milwaukee and Indiana and Florida and Louisiana and Washington, D.C., that was the model. And how well did that go? Let's look at 2017 to 18. In Washington, D.C., they found a large negative student achievement. Religious schools, they said, lack student time in core subjects. In Indiana, showed dismal results, especially in math. Indiana, Louisiana, Florida, and Milwaukee all had large student exit rates. And how did Cowen know all this? He had to make an open records request because none of that negative information about the voucher program was published. And so the sixth thing I learned from this book is it's always been about parents' rights, not about academics. We've always had a conservative presence in educational policymaking. Now, in 2005, we had Hurricane Katrina. 110 of New Orleans' 126 schools were destroyed. Oh my God, imagine that. Almost all their schools were destroyed by the hurricane. Friedman was pushing vouchers, and he said New Orleans should become a charter school city, and so they did. They moved to charter schools with shocking results, unprecedented large negative impacts on student achievement, but happier parents. And that's what it's always been about. Now a new discrimination surfaced. In Indiana, schools with particularly extreme social or religious views were allowed vouchers. $16 billion went to schools with overtly LGBTQ+ discriminatory policies. You can discriminate against people for their own feelings about their sexuality, but you can still get taxpayer money to fund that school that's discriminating. In Florida and Wisconsin, there were similar reports. Thanks, Milton. Vouchers let parents of all races avoid compulsory integration and choose whether to enroll in racially diverse environments. That's how it started with Milton Friedman. Now we add sex and gender as further motivation for school choice. From 2016 to 2019, there were negative headlines across the country related to voucher schools. They were taking higher income thresholds. So even voucher schools that started out saying, oh, we'll give vouchers to the poor kids. Now they're saying, well, to maybe not so poor. Well, you know what? And there are places where there are no thresholds anymore. The richest of the rich can get a voucher. And more pop-up schools started popping up and cashing in on the money. That's Josh Cowen, by the way. He said the idea simply did not work. The bigger and more recent the voucher program is, the worse the results have been. The bigger and more recent programs have had worse results. He says if evidence meant anything to education policy, the story of school vouchers would have ended here. In 2017, Betsy DeVos took over the Department of Education. Cowen says, now the culture war merged with white grievance politics, and the voucher impact was starting to show real harm. And so enter the ESA. You know what that is? Education Savings Account. You take local tax money and you make an education savings account. You give it directly to the family and they can spend it however they want. They can even just keep it and say they're homeschooling their child. And then the Supreme Court sealed the deal. The Koch and Bradley money pushed and pushed to get this to the highest court, make the Supreme Court make a decision. There were two important decisions. They said, denying funds to organizations precisely because they are religious violates their religious liberty. Okay? So, you can't deny taxpayer funds to religious schools for religious reasons because that violates their religious liberty. And there is freedom to discriminate against LGBTQ plus families because that's religious free exercise. So says the United States Supreme Court. Privatization of education was then called educational freedom. It was supposedly about values, not about academic success. Remember this guy? Jeff Sessions. He was the Attorney General. He said, ignore civil rights laws when they conflict with the ideology of the religious right. He said, forcing Christians to choose between their faith and the law is not right. Oh, and by the way, we have to talk about the Blaine Amendment. It was proposed in 1875 to amend the U.S. Constitution. It was an anti-Catholic movement. They were trying to keep Catholicism out of public schools. They wanted to prevent the government from granting aid to religious schools way back in 1875 because it was going to go to Catholic schools and people were against that. It failed. But 38 states have similar amendments or clauses in their constitutions, including Wisconsin. These are clauses or amendments that are meant to prevent faith-based schools from benefiting from public benefit programs. Wisconsin had that in its constitution when it was adopted in 1848. Who's lying now? And then in 2021, the Moms for Liberty entered the picture. And they said, we don't co-parent with the government. They were funded by the Heritage Foundation and the Koch brothers. And in 2022, they invited Betsy DeVos to be their guest speaker. And guess what she said? We should end the education department. Cowen says of the years 2021 to 2023, this movement went from a school voucher movement to a parents' right movement to religious nationalism through 30 years of right-wing policymaking. He calls it the direct and deliberate creation of dubious facts to support a predetermined ideological objective. Now, 2022 to 2023, Christopher Rufo said, we really need to operate from a premise of universal public school distrust. In those 2 years, more than 100 school voucher proposals were put forward in 40 states. 7 states added voucher programs in just those 2 years, and 9 expanded their programs. And most were education savings accounts. Remember what that is. You take the taxpayer money and you hand it directly to the families and say, do with it what you please. In 2023, voucher schools became universal in the state of Florida. 69% of voucher students, though, did not transfer from public schools. They were already in private schools. They just started getting their tuition paid by taxpayer money. 69% of them. And then Betsy DeVos started this American Federation for Children. She spent this federation spent $9 million in 3 states banning instruction in race, gender, etc. And $2.5 million of that came directly from Betsy and Dick DeVos. As 2023 continued, there were more than 140 legislative attempts to guarantee parental rights in education, 80 legislative attempts to ban books in schools. The Heritage Foundation issued the Education Freedom Report Card. They said, are we achieving Milton Friedman's vision? They ranked the states. Guess who came out number 1? Florida, Universal Voucher Program. Then in the case of Carson versus Macon, tuition assistance for private schools, we were told, may not be withheld because it will be used for religious education. Okay? You must give tuition assistance to a private school even if you know that money is going to be used to teach religion. And vouchers now were not just 2 religious schools, but 4 religious education, Josh Cowen tells us. And he says the year of universal choice, 2023, it was pulling together the issues of race, gender, sexuality, and educational privatization all together. Now, I'm going to tell you my take on the school voucher movement after reading this book and studying it carefully. I believe school vouchers were born of racism. I believe they have always been funded by right-wing conservatives. And when I'm telling you what I believe, it's based on the data I have read. It pivoted very quickly to religion. Remember, started in 1955, went to Catholic organization talking about religious freedom already within 4 years. It maintained the vision of Milton Friedman and Paul Peterson. It has never been honestly self-evaluated, and it always has used parental rights, in my opinion, as a subterfuge. As Cowen says, the school voucher movement has always been white, male, aggressive, and well-financed. So Cowen calls us to action. He says we should commit to direct and sustained investments in public education, and we must defend public education as a matter of human rights. I have written a summary of this book at tamarackcommunication.com in the blog called The Speakeasy. It's called How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. Comes right from the title of the book. I invite you to go to The Speakeasy at tamarackcommunication.com and read the summary, or get the book and read the book.